Mm.
So we're at a point in Nietzsche's life where his books weren't selling. He walked away from a career of certain pompous security and wealth. Women rejected him. He was getting into his 40s. He was sickly, and and even at his lowest, he was suicidal as well. But in the depths of his misery, thus spoke Zarathustra. And so, could you please explain the meaning of this book and the significance of the parable on self overcoming, where he introduces the Übermensch, when you contrast that to just how low he was in his life?
I suppose the quick answer to that question is no. I can't explain it in 1 hour. No, it's an extraordinarily rich work, philosophically and literarily. No, that's actually a cheap answer. We can say some of the important things about the book, but yes, as you mentioned, one of the interesting things is where Nietzsche was in his life personally,
Mm-hmm.
and so there always is this broader question about the relationship between philosophy and one's personal life. So abstract philosophy and autobiography. But at the same time, it's not too parochial or unique to human being because, in one sense, Nietzsche wants to argue that we all need to go on a hero's journey. And actually, the whole point of the species as a whole is a kind of hero's journey that we should be embarking upon. And just as with heroes' journeys, you have ups and downs that you go into the bowels of hell before you emerge into the sunlight again, and hopefully find your mountain to climb, or whatever the metaphor is. But what's interesting about Zarathustra is it marks a departure for Nietzsche because he was on a standard academic path. Obviously, as a young man, he was brilliant, well educated, reading all of the great works in philosophy, literature, history, and so on, and mastering classical languages as well. While his reputation is mostly as a philosopher, his PhD was in philology, love of languages, and particularly ancient languages. And then he was appointed to being a professor at a kind of a German, even though it was in Switzerland, it's a German style university. And academic life is professionalizing itself in the 1800s and so on. And so, for a lot of reasons, he breaks away from that. He resigns from his position. He goes off and starts a new phase in his life, but it's a radically different style. So rather than being in the cloistered in a nice, safe academic position and all of the formats for how you write and how you publish and so on are all worked out, he's now a free spirit, a free agent, and he's wandering around Europe and finding his voice, and out comes Zarathustra. So, not only in terms of the content of Zarathustra, but also the form of Zarathustra is original for him. And one of the very interesting things about Nietzsche, or at least reactions to Nietzsche, is how difficult it is for many people to get past not only the content of Nietzsche's work, but also the form in which he presents his work. One of the occupational hazards we philosophers have, actually most smart people, is once you get used to doing philosophy a certain way, it's hard for you to recognize philosophy when it's being done a different way. And that's on top of all of the usual obstacles of, I sense that this person is taking a position or making arguments that I don't like. They're going in a direction I don't want to go, or I think is false. And so one, especially if one's second rate or third rate, is kind of looking for excuses not to have to read a person. And so you just, well, this person's wrong, so I don't need to read them. And Nietzsche, because of the uniqueness and iconoclastic nature of most of his work, he evokes that reaction in huge numbers of people. But then on the top of that, the form in which Zarathustra is presented as a series of parables in a somewhat literary form, with a number of kind of speeches and dialogues and so on. It's not a way of doing philosophy that is recognizable to much of academic philosophy, and it's hard work. Now, so all this is very intentional for Nietzsche, but it's another reason why people who don't like Nietzsche will dismiss him as not being really a philosopher, or just say that he's not worth our attention for various reasons. Now, we can get into the particular metaphors. There's many beautiful inspirational lines in there. No matter what your views are, there's something in Zarathustra for you. But also, it is carefully calculated. It's not just a brilliant thinker working out and presenting a philosophy of life, but he also is doing it in a way where he's being highly attentive to rhetoric. One of the other occupational hazards philosophers have is, we're so focused on truth and clear argument and so on. So we're trying to be very rigorous, but it becomes dry and lifeless and deathly. There's this kind of funny line that says, with analytic philosophy of a certain sort, right? Rigor comes, but also, unfortunately, mortis. Right? So you get rigor mortis, and so it's like death to read certain sorts of things. So Nietzsche is attentive to this, and he's aware that not only does he need to have a original philosophy that is well worked out and is going to be appealing to intellectually the smartest people who are willing to stick with it, but also that it needs to be inspirational, that rhetorically, right, human beings are not just desiccated premise and conclusion kinds of beings. Right, that we want things to be vital. We want to be involved. We want to have a sense of purpose and meaning. And to go back to the language of hero's journey, that I am a hero or a potential hero, and I want to go on my journey. And partly what Nietzsche is presenting is a philosophical and a rhetorical journey that we can go on. So he's got a fictional character, Zarathustra. At this point, he's 40 years old when the book begins. He's been away, isolated for 10 years on his mountaintop. Prior to that, presumably, he had 30 years of living that was somewhat formative. Mm-hmm. And now he comes back, and then he encounters all sorts of bizarre characters and interesting characters and pathetic characters. And we see a great panoply of different kinds of individuals presented in literary form. And we see how they react to Zarathustra. We see how Zarathustra reacts to them. So all of the things that make literature, fiction literature, rhetorically powerful, Nietzsche is trying to incorporate them into this philosophical work. So the point is going to be then, I think, that you have to be very good, or at least willing to go on a journey to try to become very good philosophically, if you're going to get anything out of Nietzsche. But also you have to be willing to go on a literary journey and be willing to do all of the hard work that first-rate literary interpretation takes if you are going to get something out of Nietzsche. And then another theme, we're talking about philosophy as autobiography, and we can come back to that one. How much of Nietzsche is in this, and how much he's just saying this is the human condition. But also there's this theme that Nietzsche is always insisting on, that philosophy is a do-it-yourself enterprise. That it really doesn't do you any good to just have it all laid out to you by even a smart professor who presents views clearly and objectively, but kind of just delivers everything to you on a platter, and you can just absorb it more or less passively. Nietzsche's, one of his themes is that that's not how philosophy works. You have to do it. You have to. Another kind of metaphor. He might point in a direction, but you have to travel in that direction, right? Or he might offer some signposts, but you have to read the signposts and decide which of the many possible journeys you are going to go on. And so in that way, Zarathustra is an invitation to some hard but hopefully deeply human work.
That's what kind of one of the problems of Nietzsche, right? The fact that he's so hyperbolic, and so much, like you said, so much of the inspiration in his work in most other philosophy might be lost because of caveats and qualifiers. But instead, Nietzsche will say very provocative things that could be interpreted differently. But you have to sort of understand it in the as a contrast to the greater body of work to sort of know maybe what he was getting at. But you said that you could go into some of the specific metaphors of Zarathustra. I think that would be very, very applicable, because
Mm,
the context of Nietzsche's life as he wrote that book is so worthwhile. I think you're asking the question, how much of philosophy should be autobiographical? I think in this book particularly, it's extremely autobiographical, because he's
mm,
sort of painting the person that he wishes he could be. He sort of knows deep down that he could aspire to be, but in his life around him, in his waking hours, he's not living out that life. He's sickly,
mm.
he's depressed, women don't like him, his books aren't selling. So I think it would be really great to go into some of the specific metaphors of Zarathustra.
One of the interesting things is the choice of the name. So, thus spoke Zarathustra. So, who is Zarathustra? It's not it's not Bob, and it's not Dave or Jose. It's not like a common name. It's an extraordinarily unusual name. So right off the bat, you have to do some work to figure out who this guy is, and then we don't know a huge amount about the original Zoroaster. So, an early religious figure. I'm not even sure what his dates are. Maybe 2,800 years ago, maybe as long as 3,000 years ago, in what is now Iran.
Mesopotamia or something.
Now, even a little further east than that.
Okay.
I think he was Persian, or he came out of the people who we now think of as the Persians, and a kind of religious prophet who had standard religious training, but then also had a kind of experience when he was older, around 30 years old perhaps, and a new vision of what proper religion / philosophy quest in life should be. Had a certain amount of charisma, and so attracted a following, including some people who were quite high up. And so Nietzsche is choosing this guy in part because some of the themes are that he is more of a kind of a prophet figure, not in the sense of there just being a whole bunch of gods and goddesses out there, but seeking a more unifying principle and a more systematic, worked out understanding of the place of human beings in the cosmos. But again, we don't know a huge amount. One of the interesting things about Zoroaster, though, is the extent to which the Abrahamic religions, further to the west, so by which we mean Hebrew, and then the breakaway version that is Christianity, and then the later breakaway version that is Islam, that many of the core themes that you find in those three religions are already anticipated by Zoroaster or Zarathustra. And then, an interesting question is to the extent to which those religions are independently founded, or whether they are borrowing heavily from yet earlier religious traditions, such as Zoroastrianism. So that's one interesting theme. So there's something about Zoroaster and his journey and his way of doing religion and philosophy that Nietzsche is picking up on and wanting to revive for contemporary times. It's also clear that Nietzsche has read all of the major Greeks, and you see reflections on those, often in allegorical form or metaphorical form. But also, there's a later work that Nietzsche calls the Antichrist, and that's and anticipated significantly in thus spoke Zarathustra. So you can see that the same literary form that Hebrew scriptures and then the New Testament are written in, being echoed, in some cases played with, in some cases turned on their heads, or mirror image, all of the literary things that people are doing. So Zoroaster is, to a large extent, meant to be, Zarathustra, Nietzsche's version of Zarathustra, is meant to be put in direct contrast to someone like Jesus, who went on his own journey and interacted with people of various sorts, and there are lessons, and he spoke in parables, and we need to interpret the parables, and out of that you can get something more systematic if that's how you are inclined. So one way then of reading this then is to just read the book and ask yourself, to what extent is Zoroaster or Zarathustra meant to be a counter to Jesus in terms of all of the major doctrines of the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Mm.
And
The
remember that
idea of
for
morality.
a lot of it's going to be focused on morality for sure, but for Nietzsche, Christianity is really just a purified form of Judaism. So, can we extract, to the extent that we're analytic in
Hmm.
this way, and say Christianity stands for these top 12 points, and we list them? Can we find then the counter to all 12 of those points represented in Zarathustra? And we do know shortly after Zarathustra, Nietzsche returns to writing a little more systematically, writing Beyond Good and Evil, and then Genealogy of Morals, which is explicitly an essay format.
Yeah.
And there, clearly he is hammer and tongs going after the Judeo-Christian tradition, and kind of saying, if you didn't get the parable version in Zarathustra, I'm going to lay it out for
Yeah,
you.
explicitly.
Yes, for sure. So that's an interesting point there. Um, yeah, and then I think at some point, given the short amount of time that we have here, given that we're not doing a course on this, maybe the best way to do it would be just to pick a few favorite aphorisms or a few favorite parables from it and speak to those.
Okay, sure. Could I tee you up then to do
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. Go ahead.
Unless you have some specific on hand that you want to really
Well,
hammer down.
I do have my favorites, but this is your show, so why don't you
No,
why don't you
please.
start us off?
Please deliver your favorites, and then I'd love to just tee you up for one specific that I'd love to hear you answer.
Sure. Well, one hobby horse of mine. I might as well put a plug in for my book, right? Nietzsche and the
Hmm.
Nazis. The angle is a little bit different there, but I do spend a lot of time talking about Nietzsche.
Hmm. Really?
And
It's
another,
half the title.
well, yeah, that's right. And then I have another major journal article. It's almost a mini book itself called Egoism in Nietzsche and Rand. And in that one, it's a scholarly piece published in Journal of Ayn Rand Studies. I take up this issue in which, because often Nietzsche and Rand are conflated or they're seen as being working the same territory. So I focus on their views on altruism and egoism, both of which are central to their moral theories, and contrast them. The differences between the two are much more important than the smaller number of similarities between the two. But one of the things that I think is important to me as a philosopher is Nietzsche's reputation for being an individualist.
Mm.
And I think my view is that that's a superficial reading of Nietzsche, that Nietzsche is much more of a collectivist, excuse me, than he is an individualist. So we take the concept of the overman that is introduced in Zarathustra. So God is dead, also introduced in Zarathustra. And so God was conceived of as the great creator and the great lawgiver, and human beings are in a subordinate status. We're supposed to receive and obey and act according to
The
this
source
great
of
puppet
meaning.
master in the sky, right? And all of that sort of stuff. So with the death of God, Nietzsche then is saying that really God was just a projection by human beings of our potential that we have. So we created God, and in God we put all of our aspirations for what is possible. So what we need to do, in effect, is reclaim that creative power and see that we really are the creators of ourselves, of our lives, and we then need to be creators of new values. But quite early in the first part, in introducing the concept of the death of God, and then pointing toward the overman, what Nietzsche quite explicitly says is we human beings right now, the human being, or in the older translations, man or mankind. He's talking about the species. Is a way station on this evolutionary path. And so, what he's quite explicitly saying is you as an individual are not that important. What is important is you and your contribution to the development of the overman. So, and then he makes this very explicit evolutionary comparison. And of course, this is the early 1880s now as he's composing this. So it's 23 or 24 years after the publication of Origin of Species by Darwin. So this evolutionary matter. So what he wants to argue, though, is, what he says is, human beings in relation to the overman will be what now the ape is to human beings. So, with all of these aspirations to be your best, to become creative, and so on, it's not that you are an end in yourself. Your value is going to be to the extent that you contribute toward the creation of the overman, which is going to be a new species that exists at a higher level. So, just as the ape, this is not very good evolutionary theory, but the ape has evolved into human beings. Human beings will evolve into the overman, and so that's the end.
Mm-hmm.
And he's full of praise for people who will sacrifice themselves, who will bear all sorts of privations, and even be willing to die for this cause.
Yeah.
And the cause is not the old traditional, die for the king or die for your gods. It's not even, die for your family. It's die, right, or be sacrificed for the sake of this further species. So that very rich metaphor of evolution from ape to human to overman, I take that one very seriously, and he comes back to it over and over again. So those of you who are attracted to Nietzsche, right, because of the individualistic themes, and there are some in Nietzsche. He's very inspirational
Undoubtedly, yeah.
If you take him that way, but that's not the best philosophical reading of Nietzsche. Let me see if I can call it up. Oh, actually, this is just in the prologue section number 4. So I'll read a line.
Yeah, go for it.
What is great about human beings is that they are a bridge and not a purpose.
That's amazing. So, yeah, literally
right.
defining the evolution to the overman. Yeah,
that's right. So human beings are not the purpose. And here he's talking about the species as a whole. And you as an individual, you are not the purpose. Right? You are a bridge. Right? And we know it's either bridges are something that is a stage along the way, a crossing over to something else. So the purpose is somewhere beyond. So I would tee that one up for special attention and read everything else that comes up in Nietzsche in the light of that one.
Nice. That's amazing. I've never heard that interpretation of it before, but it does add so much flavor to the unbelievable ambition that he has, because, like we'll foreshadow for later, he tries to usurp the morality of the Bible, right? But then again, you have here, he's actually trying to evolve the species. I mean, that right. is, so there's at least
the important thing there is, rather than sacrificing yourself for these mythic, otherworldly beings
who you've never met, never spoken to, exactly. Yeah.
And let me just read one more from that same section. I love those who do not first seek behind the stars for a reason to go. Behind the stars for a reason to go under. So behind the stars, the gods or God, right, is out there. So why should I go under? A metaphor for sacrifice. I'm looking for some reason behind the stars, and be a sacrifice, who instead sacrifice themselves for the earth, so that the earth one day may become the overman's. So he's not opposed to sacrificing individuals, and he does want you to sacrifice yourself, but not for the gods, but for the future overman, whoever those beings might be.
Wow.
So, and then one more section from this, where he is a different metaphor here, that we're like a raindrop in a storm cloud, waiting for the lightning to come along.
Yeah.
So you're just a raindrop.
Yeah,
right? And how important is the raindrop?
Inconsequential, exactly.
That's right. And the raindrop is going to fall and splatter itself on the earth. I love all those who are like heavy drops, falling individually from the dark cloud that hangs over humanity. They herald the coming of lightning, and as heralds, they perish. So your job is, you will perish.
Yeah.
But your job in your perishing is that you are part of this mass, right, that is going to signal or herald the coming of the lightning. And it's really the lightning that we are waiting
And
for.
that
The
should
lightning
be
is going
the
to
value
be,
you derive rather than
that's
yeah.
right. And that will be the overman, right, or some sort of Zeus-like being who has the capacity to make things happen. So
Beautiful.
that one, that I think is important. Now, yeah, I've published on this, and I do get a lot of grief on this
Okay.
because there are a lot of people are very wedded to Nietzsche being an arch individualist and individualist all the way down and so forth. But I caution against that
Nice.
interpretation.
And that's you teasing out, in comparison to Rand, the individualist side of things. You're saying they're not in fact
Right.
synonymous. Yeah.
Right. So I think Rand is properly interpreted as an individualist, and Nietzsche, with some qualifications, is not actually much of an individualist
Amazing.
philosopher.
I before we